What could a young boy possibly say in court that would make a judge turn pale? Hey, story lovers! Welcome back to Bella Stories, where I bring the most fascinating tales right to your screen. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on any of my stories. The courtroom was silent. Every eye was on the boy standing in the middle of the room. He looked so small compared to the large wooden benches and the tall judge's seat. But his eyes were fierce, his shoulders straight. He was not afraid. Not anymore. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Thompson, looked down at him from her high seat. Her face was hard, like stone. She did not like being interrupted, especially by a child. "Young man, do you understand where you are?" she asked, her voice cold. The boy nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "But you're wrong," he said clearly, his voice echoing in the silent room. The judge's eyes widened. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She was shocked. No one had ever spoken to her like that, especially not a child. Her face turned pale, and for a moment, she looked as if she had seen a ghost. Everyone in the courtroom gasped. The lawyers looked at each other, whispering. The crowd leaned forward, eyes wide with curiosity. Even the police officers by the door were stunned. They had never seen Judge Thompson look so shaken. The boy's mother, sitting on the bench behind him, covered her mouth with her hands. She looked scared, but also proud. Her son was brave, braver than she had ever been. Judge Thompson gripped her gavel tightly. Her knuckles turned white. She took a deep breath and tried to regain her composure. "Excuse me," she said slowly, her voice trembling just a little. "What did you just say?" The boy did not back down. He looked straight into her eyes and repeated, "You're wrong." His voice was steady, full of confidence. For a moment, nobody moved. It felt as if time itself had stopped. The air was heavy with tension. The judge's face was pale, her lips pressed together tightly. She looked like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Then, suddenly, she slammed her gavel down. The loud bang echoed through the room, making everyone jump. "Order in the court," she shouted, her voice sharp and angry. But there was a hint of fear in her eyes. She glanced at the boy as if he was something she didn't understand, something that scared her. The boy did not flinch. He stood his ground, his eyes still locked on hers. It was as if he could see right through her, as if he knew something she was trying to hide. Judge Thompson cleared her throat and looked away. She shuffled some papers on her desk, trying to look busy. But her hands were shaking. She was rattled, and everyone could see it. The boy's mother whispered, "Oh my God," under her breath. She knew her son was special, but she didn't realize just how powerful his words could be. One of the lawyers stood up. "Your Honor, shall we proceed?" he asked cautiously, his eyes flicking from the judge to the boy. He looked nervous, as if he wasn't sure what was going to happen next. Judge Thompson took a deep breath and nodded. Yes, proceed," she said, her voice quieter than before. She was trying to act normal, but she kept glancing at the boy, her eyes full of worry. The lawyer began to speak, but nobody was listening. Everyone was still staring at the boy, waiting to see what he would do next. He was just a child, but in that moment, he was the most powerful person in the room. But then, the boy did something unexpected. He turned to look at his mother. His fierce expression softened, and his shoulders slumped. He looked tired, as if the weight of the world was on his small back. His mother's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to run to him, to hold him, to protect him from all the cruel eyes watching him. But she couldn't move. She was frozen in her seat, her heart aching. The boy looked back at the judge. "I didn't want to say it," he whispered, his voice so soft that only the judge could hear. Her eyes widened again, fear flickering across her face. What didn't you want to say? She asked, her voice shaky. The boy opened his mouth to speak, but then he stopped. His eyes grew wide, and his face turned pale. He looked terrified, as if he had seen something awful. His body trembled, and he took a step back. Everyone watched in horror as the boy suddenly screamed, his voice high and full of pain. No! Stop! Don't! He covered his ears, his face twisted in fear. The courtroom erupted into chaos. People shouted, chairs scraped against the floor, and the judge's gavel slammed down again and again. But the boy kept screaming, his voice echoing off the walls. Then, just as suddenly as it started, he went silent. His body went limp, and he fell to his knees, his head hanging low. His mother screamed his name, rushing towards him. But before she could reach him, he looked up, his eyes empty and cold. He whispered 2 words that no one could hear. But whatever he said, it made Judge Thompson stumble back, her face white as a sheet. Her hand went to her chest, and she gasped for breath. Her eyes were wide with fear, fixed on the boy as if he were a monster. Her lips trembled, and she whispered, "No. It can't be." Then she fainted, collapsing in her chair. The courtroom was silent once again, but this time it was a terrified silence. What did the boy say to the judge? And why did it scare her so much? Why did Judge Thompson faint? What secret did the boy's words uncover? The courtroom was frozen in shock. Judge Thompson lay motionless in her chair, her face pale, her chest rising and falling slowly. The lawyers stood with their mouths open, papers falling from their hands. The crowd was whispering, confused and scared. The boy's mother knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she held him close. "Jason, honey, are you okay?" she whispered, her voice full of fear. But Jason didn't answer. He stared at the judge's lifeless form, his eyes empty, his face cold. The officers rushed to Judge Thompson's side, shaking her gently. "Your Honor! Wake up!" one of them shouted. A doctor in the crowd ran forward, checking her pulse. "She's alive," he said, his voice relieved. "Just fainted." But what did that boy say to her? Everyone turned to look at Jason. He was just a small boy, no older than 10, his brown eyes wide, his lips pressed together. He looked scared, but also angry. One of the lawyers, a tall man named Mr. Reed, approached him slowly. "Son, what did you say to the judge?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Did you threaten her?" Jason's head snapped up, his eyes blazing. "I didn't threaten her," he said sharply. "I just told the truth." The room went silent again. The truth? What truth could be so terrible that it made the judge faint? Mr. Reed's face grew pale. He took a step back, his eyes flicking to the unconscious judge. "What truth?" he asked, his voice trembling. Jason looked down at his hands, his fingers curling into fists. He took a deep breath, his shoulders shaking. "I didn't want to say it," he whispered. "But she forced me to." His mother hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Jason, what's going on?" "What did you do?" she asked, her voice breaking. Jason looked up at her, his eyes full of pain. "I saw it, Mom. I saw what she did." The crowd gasped. What did he see? Judge Thompson stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around the room, confusion on her face. Then her eyes landed on Jason, and she froze. Her face turned white, and she gripped the armrest, her body trembling. "No. No, it's not possible," she whispered. Jason stood up slowly, his body swaying. He looked at her with a cold, piercing gaze. "You thought no one would find out," he said, his voice calm. "You thought you could hide it." Judge Thompson's eyes grew wide. She looked terrified. Stop talking," she stammered, her voice shaking. "You don't know anything." Jason took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know what you did," he said firmly. "I know about the accident." The judge's face went even paler. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked as if she was about to faint again. The crowd erupted into chaos. People shouted, cameras flashed, and reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. What accident? What was Jason talking about? Mr. Reed turned to Judge Thompson, his face full of shock. "Your Honor, what is he talking about?" he demanded. "What accident?" Judge Thompson looked around wildly, her eyes darting from Jason to the crowd, to the police officers. She looked trapped, like a cornered animal. I don't know what he's talking about," she shouted, her voice breaking. "He's lying. He's just a kid." But Jason didn't stop. He took another step forward, his voice growing louder. "You hit that woman with your car," he said. "You left her there, to die." The room fell silent. Everyone stared at Judge Thompson, their faces full of horror and disbelief. The air was thick with tension, the weight of Jason's words pressing down on them. Judge Thompson's body trembled. She looked like she was going to be sick. No, that's a lie," she whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't do anything." Jason's eyes narrowed. "You didn't even call for help," he said, his voice cold. "You just drove away. You left her in the street, bleeding." Judge Thompson's eyes filled with tears. Her lips quivered, and she shook her head wildly. "No! Stop! I didn't mean to. I didn't. It was an accident," she cried, her voice cracking. The crowd gasped, cameras clicking furiously. She had just confessed. The judge had just confessed to a hit-and-run accident. Mr. Reed stepped back, his face pale with shock. "Your Honor, is this true?" he asked quietly. Judge Thompson covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. I was scared," she sobbed. "I didn't know what to do. I panicked, and I ran." Jason's eyes were cold. "You left her to die," he repeated, his voice sharp. "You thought no one saw. But I saw everything." The room erupted into chaos once more. People shouted, pointing at Judge Thompson, calling for her to be arrested. Reporters were already dialing their phones, spreading the news. The police officers stepped forward, their faces hard. "Judge Thompson, you're under arrest for leaving the scene of an accident," one of them said, his voice firm. "You have the right to remain silent." Judge Thompson looked up at Jason, her face full of fear and regret. How did you know?" she whispered. Jason stared at her, his eyes cold and distant. "I was there," he said softly. "I saw everything, even the look on your face as you drove away." Judge Thompson's body went limp. She fell back into her chair, her eyes wide with shock. No, this can't be happening," she mumbled, her voice weak. The police officers pulled her to her feet, handcuffing her wrists. She didn't resist. She didn't even move. Her eyes were fixed on Jason, her face pale and haunted. As they led her away, she turned back one last time. Her lips moved, forming silent words. Jason watched her go, his face blank, his eyes empty. But as the doors closed behind her, Jason's body began to shake. His legs gave out, and he fell to his knees, his shoulders trembling. His mother rushed to him, wrapping her arms around him, holding him close. "It's over, baby," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's over." But Jason shook his head. "No, Mom," he whispered, his voice full of pain. "It's not over. It's just beginning." What did Jason mean? What other secrets is he hiding? What more could Jason possibly reveal? What other secrets is he hiding? The courtroom was buzzing with chaos. Reporters were shouting questions, officers were trying to clear the room, and people were still in shock over Judge Thompson's arrest. But Jason sat silently on the floor, his head resting on his mother's shoulder, his body trembling. Mr. Reed approached them slowly, his face full of concern. "Jason," he said softly, kneeling beside him. "How did you know about the accident?" Jason's eyes were distant, his face pale. He looked up at Mr. Reed, his lips trembling. "I was there," he whispered. "I saw everything." Mr. Reed frowned. "But how? That accident happened miles away from here, late at night. How could you have been there?" Jason's eyes filled with tears. His shoulders shook, his hands gripping his mother's arms. "I was in the car," he said, his voice breaking. "I was in her car." The room went silent again. Mr. Reed's eyes widened. What do you mean?" Jason looked down at his hands, his face full of pain. "She was driving me home," he whispered. "She was my babysitter." Gasps filled the room. People stared at Jason in horror and disbelief. Judge Thompson, his babysitter? Jason's mother's face went white. She covered her mouth, her body shaking. No, Jason. That's not possible. She was your judge, not your... Jason looked up at her, his eyes full of sorrow. "She was both, Mom. She watched me when you were at work, she took me to the park, she drove me home that night." His voice trembled, his body shaking. "I was in the back seat when it happened." His mother burst into tears, hugging him tightly. "Oh, my baby, my poor baby." Mr. Reed looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. He sat down on the floor, his hands shaking. "All this time, you were the witness?" he whispered. "You saw the accident, from the back seat?" Jason nodded, his eyes full of pain. "She didn't see the woman. She was talking on the phone, laughing, then there was a loud bang. The car shook. I looked out the window, and I saw her lying there, in the street." The crowd was silent, their faces pale. No one moved, no one spoke. They were too shocked, too horrified by Jason's words. Jason's body shook with sobs. "I asked her what happened. I asked her to help the lady, but she looked so scared. She started crying, she said we had to go." Tears streamed down his face. "I kept looking back. I saw the woman lying there, not moving, not breathing." His voice broke, his shoulders trembling. "I didn't know she was dead." His mother hugged him tightly, rocking him back and forth. "Oh, Jason, my sweet boy. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know." Mr. Reed wiped his eyes, his face full of grief. "You've been carrying this secret, all this time?" Jason nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "She told me to forget. She made me promise not to tell anyone. She said no one would believe me, that they'd think I was lying." His body shook, his face full of pain. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do." Mr. Reed's face hardened. "She used you, she made you keep her secret, to save herself." His voice shook with anger. "All this time, she was hiding behind you." Jason looked down, his fists clenched. "I tried to forget. I really did. But every night. I saw her face, the woman lying in the street, her eyes staring at me, even though she was dead." The crowd was crying now. Mothers held their children close, fathers wiped their eyes. Reporters put down their cameras, their faces full of sorrow. Even the officers looked shaken, their eyes red with tears. Jason looked up at Mr. Reed, his eyes full of pain. "I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to remember. But she was going to send my mom to jail. She was going to hurt us, just to save herself. His mother's body shook with sobs. I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry, she cried, hugging him tightly. I didn't know. I didn't know you were suffering. Jason closed his eyes, his face wet with tears. I just wanted it to end. I wanted the nightmares to stop. I wanted her to go away, forever. Mr. Reed stood up, his face full of determination. This boy is a hero, he said firmly, his voice strong. He carried this burden to protect his family, and he found the courage to tell the truth even when it hurt. The room erupted into applause. People stood up, clapping and cheering. They looked at Jason with admiration, respect, and love. Jason looked around, his eyes wide with surprise. He hadn't expected this. He thought they would hate him, blame him, just like she said they would. But they were smiling at him, nodding their heads, wiping their tears. They were proud of him. Jason's mother kissed his forehead, her face full of love. You're the bravest boy I know, she whispered. You did the right thing, Jason. You set us free. Jason smiled through his tears, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. The nightmares were gone. The fear was gone. He was free. As they walked out of the courtroom, hand in hand, Jason looked up at the sky, feeling the sun on his face. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth wash over him. It was over. The truth was out. And he was finally free. And that's it for today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to smash that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe if you haven't already. There are so many more amazing stories coming your way, and we can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, keep dreaming, keep exploring, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.